odd little angle here is people may know Bob Fosse's work, the famous film Cabaret, for instance. A lot of his dances, male and female, would use the bowler as a kind of erotic prop.
And Kirill, the bowler hat also became an iconic piece of headwear for the Aymara people and some other indigenous South American women. Do we know when and why?
Oh yes, but not only them actually. When Europeans came to America, the hat followed them and became very fashionable among the tribes and the peoples of America, the indigenous people there. So if we see at the traditional headwear all around Latin America, we see the Mexican sombrero, the montera somewhere in Ecuador, the bowler hats in Bolivia and Peru. They're all hats which came from Europe. Some of them arrived together with the Spanish back in the 16th century, for example. Some of them arrived a bit later. For example, the Panama hat arrived to Panama and the northern part of South America while the Europeans and Americans were building the Panama Channel. And the bowler hats also arrived apparently in the late 19th century, somewhere from America, from North America, I mean, and became quite fashionable and became really a symbol of the modern traditional costume of many people in Bolivia, in Peru, elsewhere. It's a very interesting phenomenon that hats, just as well as every other cultural element, might be borrowed, and they are borrowed all around the world.
You may know Lewis Carroll's book, Alice in Wonderland, where there's a character that's known as the Mad Hatter. It took me a while after first reading the book to realise that the madness of the character, which manifests itself in his confused and nonsensical speech, wasn't just an invention of Lewis Carroll's imagination. In fact, mercury poisoning, which has this effect on people, was a common and unfortunate occupational hazard for many hat makers in the 19th century and beyond. Why that was is one of the topics we'll be discussing in the second half of this forum from the BBC World Service in a couple of minutes.
Dark days have come for us all.
Okay, yes, we've had a problem here.
And when things are bleak, it's hard to stand tall.
I'm feeling so sad, I don't know what to do.
But whenever hard times come to call,
the water on my face and in my shoes helps me remember that this is real, that this is no dream.
Just know that soon brighter days will be here.
You know what? No one can tell me I'm not allowed to talk about this.
Days of hope.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived in the promised land.
And days of delight.
It was just pure happiness.
And days when everything just seems right.
You have conducted probably one of the greatest interviews I've ever had.
Let a BBC World Service podcast take you somewhere else.
I feel so emotional.
Search for BBC World Service wherever you get your podcasts.
Doesn't that look beautiful, you guys?
Still to come on the forum, more on the history of hats. Exuberant headdresses designed to impress that reached towering heights in 18th century Europe. Why at a certain point a vogue for felt hats for men reshaped the geopolitics of North America at the expense of the humble beaver. And why since the 1960s so many people seem to have given up hat wearing altogether. Don't go away, we'll all be back after the BBC News summary.
BBC News with Stuart McIntosh. A telephone recording has emerged in which President Trump can be heard putting pressure on Georgia's Secretary of State in an attempt to overturn Joe Biden's victory there. In the call revealed by the Washington Post, the president asks Brad Raffensperger to recalculate the vote. The Vice President-elect, Kamala Harris, called it a bold abuse of power. All 10 living former U.S. defense secretaries have urged Mr. Trump not to question the election results and not to involve the military in voting disputes. The former cabinet members put their name to an opinion piece for the Washington Post. Members of the U.S. House of Representatives have voted to retain the Democrat Nancy Pelosi as Speaker. Ms. Pelosi had been expected to win, despite her party's reduced majority in the chamber. The Indian manufacturer of the Oxford AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccine says the government is preventing it from supplying other countries. The Serum Institute said India wanted to protect its own people first. There's a bushfire alert in the southern suburbs of the Australian city of Perth. Residents have been told to leave if it's safe. Officials say there's a threat to lives and homes. Hazardous fumes are in the air from a rubbish tip which has been set ablaze. At least a dozen British citizens have been refused entry to the Netherlands since the new year, when Britain left the European single market and customs union. Dutch officials said the passengers had arrived on non-essential journeys. Under current coronavirus restrictions, travel into EU countries from most non-EU nations is limited to essential journeys only. Now to football. The Portuguese striker Cristiano Ronaldo has overtaken Pelé to become the second highest goalscorer of all time. He scored twice for the Italian club Juventus on Sunday, taking him to 758 goals. BBC News.
Welcome back to the Forum from the BBC World Service. I'm Bridget Kendall, and today I'm talking about some of the most interesting hats in history and the people who either wore them or made them. My expert guides are Professors Drake Stutzman and Ulinka Rublak and Dr. Kirill Babaev. Our first three hats took us from ancient Rome to 20th century England via Nigeria, and our fourth featured hat is from another time and place, 18th century Paris.
A headdress in the shape of a sailing ship, one of Rose Bertin's extravagant creations, a symbol of fashion.
If you could afford one of Rose's creations, and the infamous French queen Marie Antoinette was a fan of hers, you could then adorn your head with what was essentially a medium-sized, intricate sculpture. The sculptures, often 3 to 4 times the height of your head, combined your own hair, combed upwards, a large wig, and layers of different fabrics folded into luxurious shapes and feathers. But they could also be much more daring. Some looked like small gardens, and there's even a drawing of a substantial model ship perched on top of a woman's hair. Fashion became big business in 18th century Europe, especially with the arrival of colourful but cheaper foreign-made textiles. It was a kind of consumer revolution. How did it affect hats and headdresses? Ulinka.
Yes, Rose Bertin's story is quite an extraordinary one. She comes from a very modest background, from the provinces, arrives in Paris, and very quickly establishes herself in a shop called the Great Mogul. And she starts to export her designs and hats and decorations, not just to other European countries like Iberia, but also to the Ottoman world and to Russia. And what's so special about her creation is that they offer a kind of bespoke service. She would go to customers like Marie Antoinette and bring with her a lot of accessories, so lots of ribbons, little objects, to customize these looks that were called the pouf. So on top of these, by now, is these extraordinary hair creations of the great age also of the hairdresser, would then go these very high, very bespoke hatwork creations that could make personal comments, that could make political comments on current affairs, and of course they're displayed in new ways. This is an age in which women have discovered the promenade, so they go for walks and show all this off.
With the rise of a moneyed middle class, many more women could afford beautiful hats, albeit not as fantastic as those worn by pre-revolutionary aristocrats, and a lot more people started to make them. The hat-making profession soon split into hatters, who made men's hats, and milliners, who made women's head coverings. So let's look at the milliners first. Because, Drake, today millinery is often thought of as a glamorous, creative profession, but a couple of centuries ago it was anything but that, wasn't it? So what were the working conditions like for the women making these beautiful concoctions?
It has a very complicated history, actually, and just to give it a little bit of background, the hatters had a much more straightforward history. They were, they started with guilds. They weathered through the changes in machinery that changed their jobs, and also they're very well known for being very, very tough union fighters. So that's sort of their trajectory. Whereas millinery, because it was a woman's profession, the working conditions were, in many cases, extremely awful. They were so awful that they were highlighted in medical journals. The British Medical Journal highlighted the fate of a lot of these very young women, because until the 20th century, hat making was seasonal. So the girls, only with one little ability to do one little thing, they would work 20-hour days, and then when it was out of season, they would starve for 5 months. They would have no jobs, and there was a lot of competition.
And when women in the milliners' world started to organize themselves into guilds and unions, how did their male counterparts react?
Again, a very long and complicated history, but they did try to smear the women who were milliners and dressmakers, and they would sort of dismiss them as like, well, just domestic, they know how to sew in the house kind of thing. But of course, none of that was true, because if you were actually running a business, you had to know, first of all, you had to know arithmetic, you had to be able to read and write, you had to be able to handle groups of people, you had to pay taxes, you had to work with banks, you had to work with jobbers, you had to work with the various professions, and also understand the credit system. So these were very sophisticated people in running a business and running very important businesses.
In the 20th century, some milliners managed to emulate the success of Rose Bertin and cover the heads of the rich and famous. First in her native France, where, for instance, Coco Chanel started her career as a milliner, and latterly also in London. And among them is Philip Tracy, an Irish-born milliner famed for his daring architectural hats, some of them so striking that they make Rose Bertin's hats look tame in comparison. Here is Tracy in a BBC interview explaining how he goes about designing them.
Sometimes people imagine that I sort of play with a few things for 5 minutes and the hat's finished, when in fact it can take weeks and weeks. So hat making is a very labour-intensive craft that I've spent years and years and years trying to develop. And it's a very tactile medium to work in. Hat design essentially is, you're making something from nothing. So you're starting with a two-dimensional material and you're turning it into 3 dimensions.
Men's hats were usually made of felt, and for that, animal fur was often used. And the best felt for men's hats was made by dissolving the hairs of beavers, and for that you needed mercury. This turned out to be bad news, both for the hat makers and for the animals. Tell us why, Kirill.
Actually, we have in our museum in Riga, we have a very interesting ancient French beaver hat, and every time I look at it, I remember that very interesting and fascinating story about how the European fashion actually reshaped the political map of the whole continent. That happened in the 17th century, when the beaver felt hats became very popular in Europe, definitely among the aristocracy, and they needed a lot of beaver pelts to be brought to Europe to be made into hats. So they started to hunt beavers all over North America, started to communicate with local people who helped them to get more and more beavers. And so one of the tribes in North America, the Iroquois, they started to bargain, and what they got for those beavers was the guns. With those guns, they started to conquer other lands of North America, and finally they create a huge state which was called the Iroquois Federation, and which was one of the biggest indigenous states in the whole of America. So that case actually shows us that how the fashion may influence the politics, may influence the whole overall political situation in the whole continent. And one more thing that I wanted to say is that definitely this industry was not only very popular, but also very dangerous for those people who were making the hats, because the mercury poisoning that you mentioned before attacks the nervous system, and was quite common thing in the 17th and the 18th century, until the cylinder silk hat replaced the felt hat in the European fashion, and then the beavers started to normal life, back to normal life, and in Europe people stopped dying from mercury poisoning.
One thing I find particularly intriguing about hats are their names. For instance, one of the most popular hats in the 19th and 20th century was the fedora. That sounds to me a bit like a Russian woman's name, but why would a man's hat be called that? Can you help us, Kirill?
The names are very fascinating, and sometimes you never know where this name could originate from. Sometimes, for example, you have a very tricky situation. I'm from Russia, and here in Russia, even our traditional hats, most of them, they did not originate from the Russian language. They all came from either West Europe or Asia. However, at the same time, a lot of names originating from Russian became very popular names for hats in Europe. One of them was definitely fedora, which came from the theater, actually, quite surprisingly. It was a theater performance written by a French playwright who invented a murderous story of a royal Russian woman who was played by Sarah Bernard, by the way. So the play has been cited as one of the most successful in the history of theater, and the name of the hero was Fedora. So she wore the hat, which became very popular among those who visited the performances, and that's how the fashion came all around Europe. And the word fedora is actually a very popular Russian name among the peasantry. It's no longer popular, by the way, by now, but it used to be popular about a century ago. So the name didn't come to Europe without a hat. It came with a hat together.
Let's come on to our fifth and last hat for today.
A chef's toque, a tall white hat, usually with folds, a symbol of professional status and rank.
If a chef is wearing that tall white hat with multiple pleats, you can't mistake him or her for any other profession. But it turns out there are many different kinds and levels of chefs, and their ranking is reflected in the shape of the hat and the number of pleats. So in some professions, hats serve as a kind of visual shorthand. Why is that, and how did that come about, Drake?
Well, the phrase, the visual shorthand, is really good. It's good for practically any hat you can use, but obviously in professions, the shape becomes recognizable. I think one of the most easy examples is the beautiful military helmets that we're used to seeing. They're now no longer in fashion, but you know, where you'd have huge plumes 2 feet high and this kind of thing. Well, it meant that in battle, which would be very smoky, very chaotic, let's say, the infantry could actually see the commanders. So that was something that's an interesting use of the beauty of the hat to also to be something significant. But I do want to say something about the just shape in general. I think that we actually are very attracted to shape, and that we love repetition, and we love the repetition of shapes in hats. Unlike other sort of aspects of fashion, we have centuries of the same repeating shape of a hat, of all sorts of things, very often in geometric patterns. So you would have the round skull cap, which is centuries and centuries of the exact same hat. You have the cylindrical top hat, which did last for at least 200 years and more. And you have the square student mortar board, for instance. Again, we just love that shape. We don't want to change it. You could actually trace this in a certain way back to something that's an interesting phenomenon of the Ice Age, which is that the first representations that humans did going back into 100,000 years were in fact geometric patterns. So they would, you can see marks on stone of zigzags, cross-hatching, squares, circles. And then you see the hat emerge, at least on these tiny little figurines 30,000 years ago, which I think are very famous, these little naked figures, women figures, but in some cases they are wearing hats, like a skull cap, actually. So that's a very interesting development, indicating that the hat actually may be part of the whole beginning of conceptual thinking and the way humans are attracted to rendering something in geometric forms. So I think that the hat actually carries that on, and I think we take great comfort from these very primal shapes. And interesting to hear Tracy speak, because he is actually a milliner who experiments wonderfully with very primal shapes.
So that's fascinating that there might be this primal shape to hats, because if we look at our own age, it is very interesting, isn't it, that professional hats may still be around, but hat wearing in the general population, and especially among men, and especially in Western countries, declined rapidly after World War II. So, Ulinka, what are your thoughts on that?
A simple reply to the question might be that hair washing becomes ever more accessible and the umbrella comes into fashion. So that protective function, of course, was relevant, protecting from rain and dirt, and that shifts in modernity. But I think that the story is a lot more complex. And my theory about this is that I think that wearing hats became overloaded with too much meaning, and therefore also with quite a bit of anxiety. Wearing a hat was always a bit of a statement, and you get indicators that people started to worry that it might be the wrong statement. And a very good example of that is the novel Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, that tells the story of a London high society woman after the First World War, a society living with that trauma of the war. And one snippet in Mrs. Dalloway is how she goes out onto the street. She meets a man she's known all her life, and the first thing she worries about is whether she's actually wearing the wrong type of hat. Is it the right hat to wear in the morning? And we know from Virginia Woolf's own diary that this mirrored her own anxiety. People were teasing her about her hats, and we know that in graphic satire ever since the 18th century, a lot of fun is had with people who wear the wrong type of hat. So this is all now bound up with a question about, am I wearing the hat at the right angle? Drake was talking earlier about how hats are used in cinematic language, and all of these nuances start to matter so much. Is it the right hat with the right message? And it becomes very complicated as a system, very unwieldy. And by the 1960s, we really see the demise of that whole language, as it were. And it's bound up with a refusal of also the formalities that are bound up with it.
And a final word from you, Drake.
In my research, there have been some really interesting speculations about things. For instance, hairspray allowed you to make a pompadour or a beehive, and you couldn't put a hat on that. The change in cars, where convertibles came in, or smaller cars with low ceilings, meant that, hats were impractical. Hats were also costly. And also, there's also been speculation that in the Korean War, the fatality was enormous on the American side, and that the boys that came back wanted to separate themselves from the sort of fedora-wearing generation who had put them in those situations. So it's very interesting that people have so much speculation, but I also think that the hat did disappear in the 60s in a way, but also did not disappear.
Well, let's hope, given the fascinating discussion that we've had today, that hats won't entirely disappear. This has certainly given me a feeling that I must go and rummage through my wardrobe and bring them out again. That's all the hats we're going to wear for today, though. My thanks to Kirill Babayev, Drake Stutzman and Ulinka Rublak. And if this forum from the BBC World Service has inspired you to try a new hat or dig out that old favourite from the back of the wardrobe, you might agree with these words of the American actor, model and hat devotee, Mimi Wedell.
The only romantic thing left in life is the hat.
BBC World Service and now Sporting Witness with me, Simon Watts. Today I'm bringing you the story of a sports entertainer called Cameron Hughes. For 20 years he's been making a living by dancing for crowds in Canada, the United States and beyond. If you follow the NBA, American football or Major League Ice Hockey, the chances are you've seen Cameron Hughes perform, busting some terrible dance moves and giving out T-shirts to the fans.
Here she come now, say, moaning, moaning.
Imagine you're at a sporting event and there's a timeout of some kind and the camera pans to the fans. Suddenly it comes to me. I look like, oh wow, I can't believe it's on me. I then decide, you know what, I'm going to get up, I'm going to go crazy, I'm going to get in the aisle, I'm going to rip open a shirt, and then the shirt I'm going to reveal is going to be from a team.
Yeah.
I start dancing like a lunatic, and I start throwing t-shirts in the crowd. And the crowd's looking at me. Is this for real? And I keep going.
How would you actually describe your dancing style? Because it looks to me a bit like dad dancing.
I'm a really good bad dancer. I'm 6'4". I'm a big guy. That's a bit manic. I flail my arms.
And you managed to make a career out of this.
Yeah, I've done this for 26 years. It started off as a joke and then a dare, and I performed for over 30 million people in 10 different countries.
Growing up in Canada, Cameron Hughes had dreamed of a career in sport, but like many of us, he just wasn't much good.
I got cut from my high school basketball team. Being on the team, meant a lot. You wanted to wear, the team jackets, and so being able to be part of the crowd was the next best thing for me.
Cameron became the loudest fan at any high school game and an enthusiastic beer guzzler at any team party. The next step came at college, where he transformed himself into Melonhead, complete, as the name suggests, with a large piece of fruit on his head.
My roommate was playing for my small college football team, and he said to me, we need to get the crowd more fired up. It's too quiet. And I was like, okay. So I sat with it all week. By the Saturday, the day of the football game, I was like, you know what? I'm going to paint my face, my whole body purple. I'm going to get a purple cape, and I'm going to go get a watermelon. I'm going to carve it out on my head, and I'm going to walk into the stadium, and I'm going to fire up the crowd. And it was a crazy experience, but kind of took the training wheels off in terms of working the crowd.
And then came Rocky the Raccoon.
I became the mascot for a ski hill. It was about a 7-foot-tall raccoon. I'll never forget the first time I went down the hill on skis. I was pretty confident that I could do it, and I missed the last gate, and the head fell off, and kids were screaming. I was screaming for the helmet. It lasted just one season, thankfully.
After that mascot phase, Cameron was ready to take off the masks and just be himself. The act that would make his career was born at a particularly dull Ottawa Senators ice hockey match.
It was everything just added up moment where my friend asked me to go to the game. It was a Saturday night, which is big in hockey in Canada. Nobody had been cheering for 2 periods, 8 minutes to go, and I look at my friend, and I'm like, I need to do something. Why isn't anyone cheering? And he was actually probably one of my shyest friends. And he's like, please don't do anything, right? And I was like, well, I need to. And the next whistle blew, and there was a timeout, and a song came on. It was We Are Family, and I was possessed.
We are family. I got all my sisters with me.
I got up on my seat, looking at the crowd, and I started to dance on my seat. And everyone was looking at me in absolute disbelief. What's he doing? And then suddenly they were like, wait a minute. He's just trying to get the crowd going. And there was a buzz in the arena. And there was this adrenaline going through me, and I'm like, let's keep this party going. So I got up from my seat, went to the aisle, and started dancing up and down the aisle.
Everyone can see we're together as we walk on by.
And the place went absolutely nuts. The team came up to me after the game and said, hey, we want you to come back. And I was like, what do you want me to do? And they're like, just dance. And I've been just dancing for 26 years.
Cameron has been hired by teams including the New York Knicks, the Toronto Blue Jays, and the Las Vegas Golden Knights. His act is pure American-style crowd entertainment, but he says cheering does make a real difference to the players.
They all feed off the crowd. They sometimes are like, why isn't the crowd behind us? They're down by a goal or a touchdown, and they're like, come on, they need the crowd. And I can't imagine how difficult it is for athletes to walk into an empty stadium right now. I think that you need that energy, after a big play or you're in a bit of a slump, you need them to, hey, come on, you've got this.
But some dedicated fans have criticized Cameron, seeing him as a fake who'll cheer on any team for money.
I've had some fans that found out I wasn't from that city and I was doing a lot of games there, and they were really upset to the point where some of them wrote me some nasty notes. And I understand, because when you put that jersey on, you become part of the team, you become part of the city and community. But at the end of the day, I've also never pretended to be a super fan of that team. I just want to come in, make that night, make that afternoon a little extra special for you and your friends and family, and be a little bit of an extra spark.
Arguably, one event stands out in Cameron's career, the 2010 Winter Olympics on home soil in Vancouver. The Canadian was booked for so many events that he actually had to train like any athlete.
They hired me for, I believe it was 26 games or something crazy. I was nervous, actually. I was like, I don't know if I can do this. This is insane. I actually got a nutritionist. I got a health coach. I got a trainer, and I was so fit, so focused, and it worked.
And you were at one of the greatest moments in Canadian sporting history, the gold medal in ice hockey.
I was asked to be neutral at the U.S.-Canada final gold medal game, and I was like, wait a minute, this is my last game. There's no way I'm going to be neutral here. So I threw on my Team Canada hockey jersey, and I went extra crazy, and the crowd was tense because it went into overtime, and I was right behind the net when Sidney Crosby scored that magical goal, and you know, all of Canada was celebrated, and one of the greatest moments of my career for sure.
You mentioned training. Have you ever actually got injured doing your dancing?
Dancing on stairs is tricky, and you know, I've only been hospitalized 8 times, which isn't too bad. I sprained my MCL. I kept going because I didn't really know how bad it was. 20 minutes later, I'm being wheeled out, going to the hospital. I fell down the stairs once in front of 12,000 people, and they all thought it was a joke. And I was like, I couldn't get up, and no one was coming to help me. And I was like, I'm not kidding. I can't get up.
Cameron is still performing, but he was recently upstaged for probably the first time. A young fan with Down syndrome called Malcolm actually managed to outdance him.
It was Canada Sevens rugby. The song comes on, and I turn around behind me, and there's 5 young boys dancing. And I keep going, and I keep going. And I turn around, and there's one boy. And he has this grin like, hey, 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 I'm here.
Pop, pop, it's showtime. Showtime. Guess who's back again?
And it's this young boy named Malcolm. So Malcolm, then, I give him the T-shirts. I move out of the way, and he starts dancing. He starts twirling the T-shirts, and the crowd is going. I'm getting goosebumps talking right now. I'm going to cry. The crowd is like, all right, buddy, let's go. And you see him, and he's a really good dancer. And he has this smile on his face like, I'm going to keep going. And then we stop the music. He does this Usain Bolt move, and Malcolm and I start a slow clap with 35,000 people. And I've been on center court at the U.S. Open. I've met Roger Federer. I've had all these cool moments. And that was it. Because it's never been about me. It's been about empowering other people to get up and to have fun. And Malcolm was a star.
Look out! Second verse for the hustlers. Gangsters.
Cameron Hughes' autobiography is called King of Cheer. He was speaking to me, Simon Watts, for that edition of Sporting Witness.
This is the BBC World Service, where our new series of presidential profiles starts with Donald Trump.
He had monumental ambition at a very early age.
He's so desperate to be admired, it's quite easy to manipulate him.
Losing is never easy. Not for me, it's not.
They underestimate him over and over and over again.
Presidential profiles of Donald Trump, Tuesday at 9:20 GMT. This is the BBC World Service. Due to the ongoing global coronavirus pandemic, we're making some changes to our schedule. In an hour, we join Newsday, and next, the climate question replaces the newsroom.